Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about the origins of jazz fusion. So jazz fusion is a style that emerged in the late 60s, early 70s. It is a fusion of usually rock and jazz, okay, but it also fuses other things as well. It brings in sort of elements from classical music or progressive rock, maybe Latin American styles, all sorts of different things can be a fusion. So this term is actually quite confusing. Originally it was called jazz rock, which is a much better description of what's going on. But for me, as a youngster, discovering the Mavish Nocturne and Weather Report and getting the encyclopedias out, I wanted to sort of, track this music back to its origins, see where it came from. And so, reading the books, it seemed to have come from Miles Davis. Well, I knew who Miles Davis was, but I didn't know the albums that they were mentioning. So, reading the encyclopedias of rock, as I did when I was young, it pointed me back to three albums: In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew, and Jack Johnson. And I got those albums, and they were very, very influential on my development as a musician. But it didn't sound like anything like the Mavish Nocturne or Weather Report or Return to Forever or the 11th House. It just didn't sound like that at all. In a Silent Way seemed to be much more pioneering in terms of ambient music, space music. I could see it wasn't swinging like normal jazz. It had a straight beat, and there was a bit where Tony Williams sort of brought in a rock beat at one point, which I found interesting, but I didn't find the actual styles that I was hearing in fusion. I didn't hear the roots of that in there. Bitches Brew was a very difficult album when I first got that. I actually found that very hard to listen to, and I really learnt a lot studying that album, because for me it was really like a free jazz or Time No Changes, but with some straight rock beats in there. Jack Johnson, yes, that sounded a lot more like jazz fusion, I suppose. It's very famous for its sort of, swingy blues beats, that fast swing that it opens up with, and McGaughlin's great rhythm playing and Miles' incredible trumpet solo. But did it sound anything like the Mavish Nocturne? No. So I was baffled that how, you could have Jack Johnson in 1970, and then in 1971, John McGaughlin could emerge with the Mavish Nocturne. This seemed to really be coming out of nowhere. I checked out Tony Williams' Lifetime, and yeah, it was very loud. There's a lot of electric instruments, but they were swinging. I couldn't, not all the time. When they weren't swinging, it sounded sort of like Jimi Hendrix with a Hammond organ. I loved it. I thought it was amazing. But still, where were this fusion coming from? So here I am a lot older, and I've listened to a lot more and read a lot more, and I think I've got a better angle on it, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about my personal experience in sort of exploring this style of music and throwing some ideas. Now, if you want a definitive version of where it starts, I can highly recommend this book by Stuart Nicholson, Jazz Rock: A History. This is a brilliant book if you really want to understand the history of jazz rock or fusion. And it's got an excellent, overview of where jazz fusion comes from. So, my view that I'm about to go through now will be informed by that a little bit. But I'd like to take my first personal take on it. So, for me, rock music, as opposed to rock and roll, really emerges in the 1960s. So you have rock and roll emerge in the 1950s. It's basically really rhythm and blues, but it's got a pinch of country in there as well, and that really gives you a rock and roll sound. You then can bring in sort of gospel elements, and that sort of brings in the soul elements that are emerging. So in the 1960s, rock music sort of emerges, I would say, after the Beatles, after the Rolling Stones, and I feel that it really emerges fully in the UK. And I would say the first rock band, serious rock band, would be Cream. Contentious argument, but I think when you hear Cream, you start to hear everything crystallise that's going to happen in rock music after that. Before that, I think bands, you had beat groups in the UK, you know, in the US perhaps you had the Doors, but really that heavy distorted rock sound, the rock guitar, it really emerged with Cream and perhaps Jimi Hendrix. And I think the roots of that are really in the UK. Now, I think the reason for that is because of Jim Marshall and the Marshall amp. I think in the UK we had an advantage because we had Marshall amps, which gave you that rock guitar sound. If you listen to a lot of the American bands at the same time, in the mid-60s, like Love and the Doors, their guitar sound is much more rooted in a sort of jazzier sound. So, and there's the point, is that rock music, which has come out of rock and roll, rhythm and blues and bits of country music, has a huge amount of jazz in it already. You know, a lot of the guys that are coming in playing drums, guitar, you know, a bass, where would they have learnt their craft? They would learnt their craft maybe playing the blues, in the UK maybe skiffle, but a lot of those players would have also come up either being classical musicians or jazz musicians, and jazz is in there. Jazz is in rock and roll and rock music right from the start. So if we take Cream, for example, Cream is a band that comprises of a blues guitarist, Clapton, and then two jazz musicians, Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce. If you take the Jimi Hendrix group, we've basically, we've got Hendrix, who's a blues guitarist. We've got Norrie, who I think would come from sort of folk background, if I'm right. But then we have Mitch Mitchell, who's like a sort of Tony Williams, Elvin Jones style drummer. So the jazz is in there right from the start. So this idea that you're going to take rock music, which has only just developed, and we're going to mix it with jazz suddenly, and someone's going to have this fantastic idea of doing this, it's going to create a new style, is not the case. Jazz is holding hands with rock music all the way through its development in the 60s. But another thing we have to consider is if we hop over and look at jazz, jazz is really a form which basically takes popular music forms and puts it into like a nuclear reactor. So what we mustn't forget that Louis Armstrong was playing, you know, popular songs of the time. That Charlie Parker was playing popular songs of the time, or taking the chord progressions and reworking them into his own tunes, but based upon popular songs. Miles Davis became famous because he could play pop songs of the time in a way that was really artistic and emotional. All right. So by the time rock and roll comes along, of course the jazz musicians, they just start taking those popular forms. You see Ella Fitzgerald suddenly singing Beatles songs, or Wes Montgomery singing Beatles songs. I've pulled this album out to show this the case. So here we have an album from 1966, I believe, by Buddy Rich, called Big Swing Face, and on here there's two tunes. There's a version of Norwegian Wood, and there's a version of And the Beat Goes On, with rock beats in there. They're straight, they're funky, but with jazz improvisation. So is that fusion? You know, is this the Beatles versions by Wes Montgomery fusion? And I think, well, no, they're not. Jazz fusion is a very particular style that emerges in the 1960s. Now, I think it has its roots in a number of places, okay? And I don't think that actually Miles Davis, when he's dipping his toe into it and he's suddenly listening to Jimi Hendrix and James Brown, when Miles Davis starts to do that in the late 60s, that starts to inform his music, something's going on already. It's happening. What's happening? Well, across the world, all these jazz musicians that are training to become jazz musicians, suddenly they're of an age where they're also growing up with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, the Doors, and whatever, right? So those influences just start to come in. Miles Davis is very clever in that he will take musicians, younger musicians, and he's able to take them and sort of suck out of them all these ideas. And so he's been informed by these young musicians. So someone like Tony Williams, he sat there playing drums, one of the greatest jazz drummers of all time. But he's also listening to rock music and he wants to bring those things in. So I think Miles went looking for that. So what was going on with the jazz musicians? Right, well, let's have a look. Well, in America, let's have a look at some of them, what's already going on when Miles Davis is making those albums. I've pulled a couple of albums out here. I'm going to pull a few through that I've got. So, These for me are the musicians in America that are really experimenting with fusing jazz and rock in a way. And what makes them different? Well, I think what's happening is rock music has developed to a point where it is expressive in itself. People like Jimi Hendrix and the Doors, they've already opened up a form which is exciting and experimental, in which improvisation can take place. It's already happening. So those musicians aren't just plugging into rock music. They're not just doing Beatles covers or Elvis Presley songs. They're fusing jazz with a new form which is coming out of psychedelic rock, acid rock, garage rock, all those things that suddenly happened in the late 60s is almost allowing jazz in, okay? One musician that I think is very, very important, we've talked about him before on this channel, is Larry Coryell. And here's one of his very early albums called Lady Coryell. This is from, where's the date on here? 1968. So if we really think of Jack Johnson as being Miles's take on fusion in 1970, and that's what usually the books say, I'm going to try and pull albums out that are from 1970 or before, just to show other people who were doing it at that time. So here we have, back in 1968, Larry Coryell's making this album. Larry Coryell on guitars, Bob Moses on drums, Elvin Jones on drums, Jimmy Garrison on bass. So he's really got Coltrane's rhythm section here. But when you listen to this album, this is a musician that is listening to rock music and jazz, and it's just naturally assimilating into his style. Of course, Larry Coryell carries on through the late 60s, right up until 1970, where he makes an album called Spaces with John McLaughlin from the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So he's there creating fusion. That's one musician. Now, Larry Coryell he'd come to attention in Chico Hamilton's band. And Chico Hamilton's band in the 60s has got elements of fusion going on. But he also, he was working with Gary Burton. Now, I would say that Gary Burton in the 60s is probably the most important musician for jazz fusion. I think he should get the credit. The sort of fusion he's making isn't actually going to be hugely influential on, say, the Mahavishnu Orchestra or even Weather Report. Well, look where those influences come from. But he's definitely doing certain things which are jazz fusion. There's an album from 1967 which I haven't got, called Duster. That's well worth checking out. But the two albums I have got would be Gary Burton and Keith Jarrett and Throb. And this album is this double CD, if you can get hold of it, or check these albums out. So Duster, Throb, and then the Gary Burton, Keith Jarrett album. Have a listen to those albums and you hear proper jazz fusion going on, and that's from 67 up until about 1970. What's really interesting for me with Gary Burton is then Pat Metheny's really listening to Gary Burton. So when he emerges in the mid-70s, he takes fusion into another realm, which has now become one of the sort of Pat Metheny way of doing fusion. He's has become a way of doing it. So not only did Gary Burton be one of the first fusion players, but he also in the end does really influence jazz fusion. Here's a band called The Fourth Way. This is a band created by New Zealand pianist called Mike Nock. They're also making fusion. This is recorded in 1968. I've never been too sure what this album is here. I bought it in Greece, I think. Quite hard to get hold of Fourth Way albums. And it's just called Historical Masters, and it's recorded live at New Orleans House, Berkeley, 1968. Talking about Buddy Rich in the 70s, he does start making fusion. I've put a couple of Buddy Rich fusion albums up in the background, but in the 70s he had a tenor saxophone player called Steve Marcus. And Steve Marcus also made an album, I think around about 1968, called Tomorrow Never Knows. I would class that as one of the early fusion albums. It's quite way out. It's got Larry Coryell on there. Another guy that I think is pretty important on the American scene that would be Jeremy Steig. Jeremy Steig was a flute player. He had a band called Jeremy and the Satires, had Laurie Coryell on guitar. You know, he makes a ton of albums through the 60s, which I haven't got. But one of my favourite fusion albums from 1970s is this one. This is a sort of Italian reissue that I've got. I think the album here, it's just called Jeremy Steig, Jan Hammer, Don Elias. I think it's called Home, the original album is. This is one of my favourite fusion albums of all time. And I would argue, if you check this album, because some of the other earlier Jeremy Steig albums, they are fusion, but they're a little unfocused. But by this point, he's really doing something heavy. And I think this album is 1970. And for me, he's further out than anything Miles is doing on Jack Johnson on this album. Sorry, but that's the case. This is a heavy fusion album. So Jeremy Steig, you know, needs some serious props. Of course, Jeremy Steig, just as a side comment, he got sampled a lot by the Beastie Boys. And I can remember watching Shrek 3, I think it is. And there's a bit where the Pied Piper of Hamelin comes out and plays a flute. That flute is played by Jeremy Steig, and it looks like Jeremy Steig, and he plays a Beastie Boys track where it's a Jeremy Steig sample. I found that fascinating that Jeremy Steig crops up in Shrek 3 until I did a bit of research and found out that his dad actually created Shrek. So there's a bit of random facts for you that might be a bit interesting, you know. So yeah, Jeremy Steig, fantastic artist. And these albums, the early 70s albums especially, are really worth checking out. I want to show you an album now that is not that well known. I grew up with this. It was in my dad's record collection, so I listened to it from a very early age. And it's by Roger Kelleway, and it's called Spirit Feel. It was made in 1967. It's not fusion as in it's got rock beats on, but everything on here is in odd time signatures. So the first tune is in 11/8. The next tune is in 10/4. There's some stuff in 5/8, 7/8, 7/4. This is very influential on me. Now, Roger Kelleway at this point was working with the genius that is Don Ellis. And in 1968, Don Ellis made an album called Electric Bath, which not only had like rock beats, sort of high instrument arrangements, psychedelica. It really, you know, had all those things, pioneering this way before a lot of people had done. I think Don Ellis really needs to get, you know, some credit for inventing fusion. In 1977, when he made an album called Soaring, that's an incredible jazz fusion album. But Electric Bath is monumental, absolutely monumental. Of course, in America at this time, we're getting some of the rock bands are becoming very jazz influenced, like Blood, Sweat and Tears in Chicago. So I hope I've sort of discussed a little bit there the sort of American fusion scene. But, and it's a big but, as I said, rock music in the UK is developing in a much heavier way than it is in America. And so progressive rock, jazz fusion also has its feet in some of the styles that emerged in England, especially London, in the mid-60s. Here's a band, Graham Bond, an album called Solid Bond, which came out in the 70s but collected a whole bunch of jams together that was happening right early in 1964. Now for me, this is as early as we get for jazz fusion. So the lineup on here: Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, Dick Hextall-Smith, John Heisman, John McGoughlin. And when you open this up, this is not just the beginnings of fusion, it's the beginnings of rock music. And this is what's really hard to undo, okay? These musicians at this time are creating, you know, we've got, you know, working at the same time in London as this, we've got Eric Clapton, we've got Jimmy Page, we've got Richie Blackmore, you know, so we've got the beginnings of heavy rock, heavy metal, we've got the beginnings of progressive rock, but I also think we've got the beginnings of jazz fusion. All right, so if we fast forward to 1968 and we pull out an album by Jack Bruce, Things We Like, which has John McLaughlin's on here, Dick Hextall-Smith, John Heisman, pretty much the same group of players. Here we have, I would say, fully fledged early jazz fusion. Okay, those ideas are all forming around John McLaughlin. So when McLaughlin goes to America in 1969, after he's made an extrapolation, and brings that stuff right into the heart of New York, and then he gets pulled in by Miles Davis. I think we have to really give McLaughlin the credit here of really pulling in those ideas from the UK. Of course, Dave Holland had gone across as well, and he was aware of what was going on in the UK at the same time. Hendrix had come over to the UK and worked in London and picked up that thing and then taken it back to America. And of course, I think Hendrix was so important in the development of jazz fusion. And Hendrix, of course, is influencing guitarists like Larry Coryell and John McLaughlin. But I think this is the secret thing. It's stuff that happened in London, right, in the mid-60s, which really created not just fusion, but also progressive rock, and heavy rock, heavy metal. That's a really important thing to, distinction to make, I think, when we're talking about jazz fusion. So, but I don't think it just ends there. I'm going to just bring in a little bit more before I finish up with this exploration of early jazz fusion artists. I brought one album out. It's called Talkin' Jazz. It came out in, I think, 1994, and this is a compilation of artists on the FMP label. Now, the FMP label MPS label. And MPS was a label for primarily German, European artists. It did also have George Duke on there as well. But if we go through some of the artists here, we've got Dave Pike from 1969, Wolfgang Daunier from 1969, Johnny Turpin from 69. We've got Deiter Reith from 1966, Coryell from 1968. Now, anyone who checks this album out, what you'll find is a really compelling mixture of sort of psychedelic jazz rock. Okay, so I think there's a lot of fusion also going on in Europe as well in the late 60s. This album is chock full of artists doing that sort of stuff. So I think, what can we conclude from this? Well, what I think it is that, of course, Miles Davis, being the great artist that he was, has gone down in history as sort of invented jazz fusion, whereas really it was invented by a whole host of people all over the world. What Miles was very clever to do was to pull musicians in of a certain age that were to bring those things into his group and to be open enough, to let those things in with an ear for what was going on, which Miles was brilliant at. I think one of the things we can say that Miles did was he made those albums In a Silent Way, Jack Johnson and Bitches Brew. I think we can say that it's improvisation of the highest order. I think that was one of the problems that jazz had when it started to mix with rock music. The rock music forms were quite simple. People are just playing over a couple of chords. There's like sort of bluesy stuff. How do you make it so you can express yourself in a really expressive jazz way? Well, I think if you go through a lot of the artists I've just mentioned, you'll find they are trying to do that, but to not always great success. I think Miles Davis showed that there was a way of improvising over rock beats, and in sort of popular music forms, more modally forms, where you could improvise at a high level. And I think that's what Miles does. Of course, what Miles does on those albums is very influenced on Weather Report, and I would argue that the sort of Weather Report angle of fusion, that much more spacey way of playing, Miles' influence is very strong in there. I think if you listen to the early 70s Herbie Hancock, he's really taking some of the ideas from late 60s, early 70s Miles, and he's pushing it down his own route. And I think when he realises that there's not much commercial potential in that, and he decides to form Headhunters, there's still that little, bit of inspiration that has come from Miles Davis. But I think in terms of the Mahavishnu, which I would say is possibly the great moment for jazz fusion, I think John McLaughlin brings that in himself, and I think it has its roots in that incredible scene that existed in London in the early to mid 60s. I really think that's where it was pioneered. John McLaughlin had a group around about 65 with a singer called Duffy Power. And it was Duffy Power on vocals, McLaughlin on guitar, Jack Bruce on bass, and Ginger Baker on drums. And it really is, it's pre-Cream. And if you listen to that, you'll hear not only the roots of a sort of a really true jazz fusion, but you also hear the roots of rock music and progressive rock. It's an incredible achievement that seems to have gone by the wayside for many people, but those tunes are on YouTube. Go and have a listen to them. They're quite shocking that these were made sort of 64, 65. They sound ahead of their time. So that's my take on jazz fusion. I hope it's been interesting, and I hope I've the main thing is I've alerted you to some artists that you may not have heard of and that you can go and check out. And if you like the video, like it, and if you want to subscribe, but most importantly, put your opinions in the comments. Thank you very much.